Hey chess friends, it's Rafi Chaudhry here, and in today's video, I am going to be analyzing a game between Grandmaster Sam Shankland and Grandmaster Marinco, S. Marinco. I'm not sure exactly what his first name is. We can look him up real fast. Let's see here. Sandro. So Sandro Marinco must be the player. So this game is actually the English opening, which I've been studying for some time now. And I thought that I would just, create a video just kind of going over some of the ideas in the English opening and kind of study this game with you guys and see if we can learn something awesome. So obviously, as you can see from the result that's posted here, the game was a draw. But let's just see how this played out and how Sam Shankland was able to make this draw with Grandmaster Marinco. So the players' ratings are well over 2,700. Sam Shankland is 2717 and Marinco is 2643. So pretty strong players. So let's go ahead and begin our analysis here. So game started with Sam playing c4, which is the English opening, and then Black played the move e5, which is a pretty standard response to the English opening. And then White played g3, which is also again very standard response. White's going to develop his bishop to this long diagonal and start putting some pressure on this long diagonal. So Black played knight to c6, which develops a knight and also prepares to guard the square on d4. So White puts the bishop on g2, taking over the long diagonal, and now he has a lot of potential. So in the English opening, typically White is trying to guard these light squares right here. So then Black now continues with f5, which now leads into sort of like a Dutch-ish type of system against the English opening with e5 inserted in there. So this is a very challenging, oftentimes it can be very challenging for White, who is actually playing on the queen side in this opening, whereas a lot of times in this kind of opening, Black tries to go for some sort of checkmating idea on the king side. Kind of similar to what happens in the King's Indian, where White's playing for this queenside attack, whereas Black is just developing his pieces and just going for this checkmate threat. So if Black's attack succeeds, White's gonna get checkmated. But if White's attack succeeds, the most Black will lose is some queenside, maybe some pieces or some positional advantage. But it's not gonna be the end of the game. So it's very tricky when this kind of thing happens. So let's see how this game played out. So after f5, White chose to go with knight to c3, developing the knight and putting more control over these central light squares right here. To which Black responded with knight to f6, also challenging the light squares in the center now. White played the pawn to d3, again controlling some more light squares, which is on e4. Black played bishop to c5, kind of eyeing the pawn on f2 and developing a piece and getting ready to castle. White plays a move e3, which blunts this bishop's diagonal immediately and also puts a pawn to guard the square on d4, which has become basically a hole for both of Black's pieces, the knight and the bishop, and also the pawn on e5 was giving control to that d4 square. So White right away takes away that d4 square from Black, Black pieces. Black continues with d6, which basically gives some support to the center pawn on e5 and also to the bishop on c5, and plans to bring out his bishop maybe to d7 or to e6 in the next couple of moves. So in this position, White chose to go with knight to e2, which develops the knight but does not put the knight in front of the bishop's diagonal by putting it on f3. And also on f3, the knight would get hit with some sort of e4 ideas any moment. So White goes ahead and recognizes that and puts the knight on e2, which guards the d4 square, gets out of the way of this long diagonal bishop, and eventually in the future, maybe there's some possibility of playing f4. And if the black pawn were to ever push to e4, then there's a possibility of knight going to f4. And this knight also gives some support to this knight on c3. So Black played the move a6, and the reason for a6 is probably because Black at some point will play a move like rook to b8, followed by b5, trying to challenge White's c4 pawn, which is very well advanced in the center and controlling some key central squares on d4, and also taking away this b5 square from the knight. Now White pushes to d4. So White sees that there's a potential to go ahead and push the central pawn, which asks a question to the bishop on c5 and also the pawn on e5 at the same time. And if Black were to capture on d4, White could capture back with the e pawn and have his really nice two central pawns here, and also force black to move his bishop again, making black waste a tempo with the bishop. So black chooses to move the bishop back to a7 here, and keeping the bishop on this diagonal. And now white plays a move b3, which now supports c4 and also prepares to develop his bishop maybe to a3 or to b2 on this long diagonal, or on this diagonal right here. So the idea of bishop a3 might be that if d takes c5, then black really won't feel that comfortable taking with the d pawn because the rook would be hanging, or black won't be able to castle if he doesn't do that yet. So there is also that type of ideas, but also b2 is a possible square for the bishop. But it'll be in a long diagonal, it'll be controlling a lot of solid squares on this diagonal. So black plays the queen to e7, which again blinds up the queen with the king, and also prepares some ideas of it sometimes taking on d4. And if white were to take, there's some pressure on knight on e2. So that's a good place to develop the queen. There is not a better place to develop the queen really right now. If you put it on d7, it's in the way of the bishop. And there's also some possibility that black might castle on the queen side here. He might play bishop to e6 or d7 and castle on queen side. And that's also one of the reasons why he might have moved the queen to e7. White castles king side. And black plays a knight to d8. Now we have to stop and think about this move for a second. Why did black play knight to d8? Some possible reasons might be that he wants to bring the knight to e6 to put some pressure on d4. It could be that he wants to play a move like c6 or c5 to challenge white's center even further. It could even possibly be that he wants to shift the knight to f7 and to push through with a move like g5 and attacking the king side here, with the, followed by rook to g8, something like that. So multiple ideas here with knight to d8. And also, I think black just went ahead and preemptively moved the knight away from a possible d5 push, which would hit the knight and make it move to that type of square anyway. So white goes ahead and captures on e5, and black captures back on e5 with his pawn, opening up the d file for his queen and also potentially in the future his rook. And then white plays the pawn to e4, striking immediately at black's center pawn cluster. The pawns on e5 and f5 were looking very strong, and also looking to open up the diagonal for the bishop and get rid of this pawn on e3 that was blocking the bishop on c1. Now the c1 bishop is ready to develop itself to g5, or maybe even to e3 potentially, but most likely on g5 and pin this knight to the queen. And so e4 is a pretty useful move here. Black just ignores it and castles. Black's idea is that if white captures here, he will capture with the bishop and develop a piece with the tempo at the same time. White now develops his bishop to e3. Again, this bishop was eyeing the king side for a long time, so at some point white wants to play the pawn to f4 maybe. So now he's like, well, if you're gonna either give up the bishop and white will capture back on e3, and he will have some doubled pawns and he'll have a weakness, but this is not as much of a weakness because this pawn on e3 can actually guard f4 and d4, which are crucial squares. And so for the time being, the pawn can't really truly be attacked very easily either. If knight g4, there's always moves like queen to d2, holding on to the pawn. So with that in mind, white doesn't feel that much threatened to play this kind of move on bishop e3 and doubling his pawn structure. Also, this pawn on e4 may at some point take here, and then we can push this other pawn to e4 at some point, and it won't be a weakness or a backwards pawn anymore. So black plays c6, which he does because he wants to take away this d4, d5 square from white's knight, or potentially even the queen. White captures the bishop on a7, and black takes back, which puts the rook in a very awkward position for the time being. And then white plays queen to d3, developing the queen to a centralized square, and also eyeing the pawn on f5 and putting pressure on that pawn now. White plays the knight to f7, with the idea of maybe going to knight to g5 and bring the knight closer to the king, or maybe, like I said before, maybe potentially pawn to g5 There's also some ideas of potentially putting a queen or a knight to d6, and also trying to control some of the squares in the d file as well. But most likely he went to f7 now to maybe potentially play the move g5 in the future. There's also some idea of playing knight to h6 followed by knight to g4. So those ideas are all there. And now the knight on f7, the rook is ready to come to d8 and start challenging the queen right away. So white chose to go ahead and accept the free pawn. It is a free pawn, but I think it's a pawn that's going to be really hard to hold on to because it's so awkwardly placed on f5 and it cannot easily be defended. So if black wants, he can always pick up the pawn with something like knight to h6 followed by knight takes f5. There's all sorts of ideas of taking this pawn back. So black is not so worried about the pawn. He just wants to get some good squares for his pieces and get his pieces activated. So most likely we'll see moves like rook to d8, rook to d7, and pawn to b5 or b6, swing another rook over to d7, things like that. So he does go to h6. Now his plan is to pick up the pawn on f5 and bring his knight to a better position. White lines up his rook with his queen, and now he really is trying to control the d file as much as possible. Black can't play rook to d8 anymore because he would lose the rook. Queen takes rook. So then bishop takes on f5, regaining the pawn, recapturing the pawn back, and hitting the queen on d3, and developing his last piece, which was the bishop. To which white responds by playing queen to e3, which again puts the queen on a centralized square, and then now it hits the rook on a7 with a tempo. The rook goes back to a8, and now it's planning on coming d8 to challenge the white rook on the d file. White plays the move h3, which basically takes away this g4 square, which all three of black's minor pieces were eyeing. So bishop g4, knight g4, this knight to g4, all were possible moves. And any of these moves, the knight moves, would hit the queen. So white goes ahead and takes away that possibility. Bishop goes back to g6. Perhaps he wants to bring this knight on h6 into the f5 square now, because the knight on h6 isn't really doing a whole lot now that the g4 square is taken away. So white plays the move g4 himself, taking away this f5 square from the knight and from the bishop, and also threatening the move g5, which would pin, or which would fork the two black knights. So black plays the queen to c7, which as soon as white played the move g4, you notice that these dark squares around the white king have become rather open and undefended. So black probably wants to go ahead and start controlling some of those squares with his queen, and maybe at some point start putting some pieces into these dark squares like f5, for example, or f4 rather. So you can see that there could be a potential knight maneuver somehow into squares like g5 and to f4, and that could be a very strong attack because it's backed up by the queen and the rook at the same time, and then also the pawn on e5. So the queen goes to now c5. Again, white's doing kind of the similar idea. He's trying to control some of these dark squares, and he's ready to go ahead and put the rook to maybe d6 and line up the rook to d1 and start penetrating with the rook. And this is also a centralized, more active square for the queen as well, which eyes e5. Potentially b6 can't be played because queen takes c6 is now in the air, things like that. Also, there's some future threats of playing knight to d5 if this knight were to move, and that would basically put the knight on a good square and make the queen move again. So because white's c5 square is a very active square, black goes ahead and challenges the white queen on the c5 square right away with knight to d7. White now improves the queen position to some extent, although the queen will come under some fire from the rooks probably very soon. But for the time being, he puts it on e7, which pins the knight and gets the queen closer to the king. So black chooses to defend the knight again with the move rook to d8, a to d8. So white was threatening to capture the knight on d7. So then white now goes ahead and challenges the bishop on g6 with his own bishop. And if black were to capture on e4, then the knight on here, c3, would capture back with the bishop and would come to a much, really good central square and starting to eye some of these dark squares also. So black doesn't do that, and instead he chooses to attack the queen on e7 with the rook f to e8. And the queen retreats now to h4. keeping an eye on the d8 square, and also keeping this pin active for as long as possible, but also moving the queen to a safer square. So now black goes ahead and moves the knight to f8, and that offers an exchange of rooks and also challenges white on these on the d file. And also at some point he's eyeing the e6 square, so his plan might be to play knight to e6, followed by knight to d4 or to knight to f4. He's eyeing both of those really good squares, which because white played the move like g4, now these squares are not going to be in white's control as well anymore with the pawn, so black is now trying to take advantage of those squares by bringing his knight into those squares, potentially in the future. So white plays the queen to g3, which basically tries to give some support to the f4 square and also keeps pressure on e5. Black moves the other knight to f7. Again, the knight on h6 wasn't really doing anything. It didn't have any good prospects. The knight on the rim is dim and its chances are slim. So he goes ahead and puts the knight on to f7, from which it will come to maybe g5, maybe it'll come to d6, etc., hitting the bishop, things of that type. Queen goes to e3. The queen goes to e3 again to keep eye on some of these dark squares here on this queen side of the board, some on the king side as well. And it may potentially also support some sort of an f4 push in the future. Also, the queen move, by the way, I forgot to mention, the queen on e3 actually was probably also played because he doesn't want to get challenged on the e4 square. So he's basically preventing, Sam is basically preventing the knight to g5 move. The bishop takes e4 happens next. Bishops get traded. And white chooses to actually capture back with the... Oh, that was the last move. So here, the both players agreed to a draw. Probably in... because after knight takes e5, I think there might be a lot of exchanges happening soon here. Maybe knight to d6. Something like that. Maybe knight takes d6. Rook takes d6. Rook takes d6. Queen takes d6. In view of all of these moves, probably that the players chose to take a draw here. So again, guys, it was a fun fun game, interesting game to watch. There was a lot of positional maneuvering that we saw with the minor pieces, and the main thing, key takeaways from this game is that each of the moves that each player made also they had a very systematic approach. Each move was very consistent with the overall themes and ideas in the game, and as those plans evolved and shifted, you saw the move pieces were constantly getting into better and better squares and aligning themselves with the overall plan. So always when you're making the moves, make sure that each of the moves that you make ultimately follow through with the plan. So one thing to consider asking yourself is picking up all the pieces in your head off the board and asking yourself, where is the best square on the board that I can place this piece? Once you find the best square for your piece, start asking yourself, how can you get that piece there? How many moves will it take? How much time will I need to get it there? And once I get it there, can it be chased away from that square? And in general, it's a good idea to start moving your pieces closer and closer towards the enemy's king, because that way your attacking chances increase. Also, keeping your pieces protecting each other is a good idea in chess, so that there's no tactics of pieces getting captured by other pieces. Tactics tend to favor the player whose pieces are well protected and coordinated with each other. Also, general principle is also to keep your pieces on diagonals and squares where they have a lot of range and they're controlling lots of really good key squares in the enemy camp. Like on queen on e3 was guarding all of these dark squares here. We saw the knight coming to e6 potentially and guarding all these crucial dark squares that white didn't have control of. So getting your pieces to squares that are out of your enemy's reach and taking those key squares away from your enemy in his side of the board is definitely a good plan also in chess. So hopefully you guys enjoyed it. Thank you guys again for joining me in this game, Sam Shankland versus Grandmaster Marinco. Hopefully I will catch you guys in the next video. And if you have any ideas or suggestions, leave them in the comment below. Thank you and take care. Bye-bye.